2:59, so you can start streaming. Thank you. We'll just wait for Jeff. Thanks. Welcome everybody to the 1st of March infrastructure meeting. I'm going to start with apologies, and I have that from Councillor Abbott. Can I please have someone move that? Thank you, Councillor Lewis. Seconded, Councillor Ludlow. I'll put that motion. All those in favour? Aye. That is carried.
Mr Chair, can I just apologise for an early departure from the meeting due to a Southern District Health Board meeting I'm going to have to attend at 3:30.
No, that would be fine.
Thank you.
Okay. Right, there is no public forum today. We're going to move on to the receipt of a major late item, which is the officer's report to the notice of motion that appears today. Can I have someone move that, please?
Yes.
Moved Councillor Soper, seconded Councillor Skelt. Put that motion. All those in favour?
Aye.
Okay, now we'll go to the minutes of the committee meeting 1st of February 22. I'll move that we receive these minutes and the amendments that are within them. Can I have someone second that, please? Councillor Skelt, thank you. Any discussion on those minutes? I'm going to put that motion. All those in favour?
Aye.
Against. Just as a matter of interest regarding the content of the minutes with the alternative Three Waters group, I just thought I'd update the committee on how the other cities voted. Christchurch voted 11-3 in favour of joining the alternative work group. Excellent. And Dunedin just recently, last week, voted 8-7 in favour of joining. Okay, that moves us now on to the notice of motion by Councillor Clark. So what I'm going to do first is we have the staff report. Steve, can you please take a seat up there? And I'll get you to proceed with your report, and then we'll have some questions.
Thank you, Mr Chair, Your Worship and Councillors. Before I cover the elements in the report, I'd just also like to note an apology. Councillor Clark had requested some information both on the range of options that are going for consultation. I had sent that around 2 weeks ago, and I have not been able to get that to him, and I apologise to Councillor Clark, so I apologise to you too. That information would have been helpful today. However, we will carry on. In terms of the officer's report, we've approached this in two parts. The first part is the part related to council contacting and writing to the Southland Museum and Art Gallery Board, and the second part is related to the program in order to meet the 20th of December 2022 deadline of removing the collection from the current facility. So I'm going to touch on the elements leading around the legal element of the lease and what council can do in terms of writing to SMAG. And then when we come to talk to the program, Lee, Erin and I can talk to those specific elements. In terms of the implications and risks of this notice of motion, the first point I'd like to make is that the options are being consulted on in the annual plan, which will commence later this month. And the options and the work, especially on the new cultural facility, Te Anua, that work can't commence in terms of detailed design or the procurement of any of the design team until council determines and decides a final option, and that's planned for later in June this year. That's a key time frame because it means that we can't really start any further detailed work on the final option until you've decided. That will be covered off in the program a bit further. In terms of the financial implications of this, we have been modelling the costs of the options that again will be consulted in the plan. We haven't modelled the costs of the notice of motion in terms of the location or the fit out or any of the consenting costs associated with trying to meet that updated deadline, and that's why I've made that point there, that we can't provide you any financial update on that aspect. In terms of the legal implications, council is the owner of the land, and we do have a lease with the Southland Museum and Art Gallery Board. That lease was last reviewed and signed up in September 2010, and that lease goes through until 2043, and that is for the current footprint of the building and the support services around the building. It would be appropriate, in our view, to contact SMAG to say that the intention will be through either of these options that you choose through the annual plan, to write to them to say that we will be amending that lease and likely to be finishing that lease with a view to enable the refurbishment or the redevelopment of a new facility. So that is an appropriate response to write to SMAG on that. Equally, council have determined that council is the owner of the building, and we can equally write to SMAG on that basis as well. So it is appropriate for council to write to SMAG to set out the intention of the project. Obviously we have members around the table, but staff also support the SMAG board through a contract of service, so they are aware of this project. In terms of risks, our advice is we can't meet the 20th of December deadline, and Lee's going to cover off some of those reasons why. Critically too, we're working to a fairly tight time frame on pulling the options together and having them ready for completion as set out in the long-term plan. Any work towards trying to meet the 20th of December deadline is actually going to be diverting the core project team towards managing that part of a new project which hasn't been costed or allocated any time or resource. That will come out of the project team, and so that means that we will be stopping something else. And so that is a risk to consider when you take this notice of motion. My only other point to note here, we have asked our insurance brokers around the would a move trigger any change to the insurance coverage. We're still awaiting that advice, and so in the second line in that last paragraph under risk, it'd be appropriate to adjust the word will to may, and that is to however, advice from council's insurance broker is that any move of the collection to an alternative facility may require the facility housing the collection to be assessed as 100%. We haven't got that in writing. We thought we would have that by now, so we apologise for not getting that advice. But one last point before I pass on to Lee to talk about the program, and we do have a slide for Lee to talk through as well. And that's the last row on page 4 of the report, the collection, cataloguing and packing. So we've made the note in here that, as you know, the collection is currently at a state of 76 packed, ready for relocation. So this is a measure of volume, not time. So 76% of that collection is ready to be relocated, however 24% is not. And the work required, both in terms of cataloguing and packing, cannot be achieved within the time frame in order to meet the 20th of December. This is time allocated at this stage. At the best, it's 12 months to undertake that cataloguing and packing. And so that's why, from a collections packing point of view, we can't provide that advice to you today that we can meet that deadline. Now I'm going to pass over to Lee, and he's going to run through more of the procurement and the technical elements of the program as well, and we'll line up what is the current plan of attack for the relocation of the collection against the proposed notice of motion deadline and what we need to do.
Thanks, Steve. I think there's going to be a couple of slides which will pop up on the screen. They're not hugely easy to read, but you'll get a flavour. For the storage facility, there's a number of just fixed processes that we have to go through. So whether we do one on Tidsbury, whether we do a temporary one, we kind of have to go through very similar processes. First of all, I'd like to say that we're currently tracking the early works on Tidsbury. So the plan to date and the work we've set out and the program we've set out, we're currently tracking that. The team is working incredibly well in that space. So we're comfortable that the timeline we've set for the Tidsbury is a good timeline, and all indications at the early outset is that that will be achieved. If we move down onto the lower portion of the screen, as you can see there, that is lots of small bars, and that's going to achieve the date set out in the councillor's motion. What's going to be very difficult for a lot of you to read that is to source a sustainable building. We're only going to give ourselves 10 days. Then we've got to enter in some sort of lease agreement. That's assuming either we own the building or we don't own the building. We've also only given ourselves 10 days to do that. We've then got to fit out whatever building we find, and we need to make sure that building gets designed. So if we're making any changes to any building to make it suitable to house the collection, we're going to have to do some design work. Then we're going to have to go through a consenting process. Now, consenting, typically 20 days is what you sort of plug in there. We've had to put in 15 days to make the timeline work. So we're asking the consenting team to really sort of box beyond their norm. The next is then to procure a contractor, and we all know how difficult that is in the market these days. We've got to find someone to actually do the work, and we've given ourselves 30 days to do that. Typically 90 days to 120 days in the market is what you kind of expect from a normal tender process. The building fit out in itself, so once we find a contractor, we figure out what we need to do to the building, then we actually need to do the work. We've actually given ourselves 15 days to achieve that. Commissioning the building to make sure that all the alterations and changes we've made work and that we can move the collection into a suitable building. Again, we've only given ourselves 20 days, where we'd normally look for a lot longer. And then relocate the collection. Now, as Steve's mentioned, there's some challenges around that. In our plan, we've allowed 120 days to move the collection. Now, that's a collection that is already packed and catalogued. Steve's already mentioned we're not at that state yet. So we've given ourselves 90 days to move that. Now, that would achieve the date as noted in the councillor's motion, but the reality is none of those timelines are sustainable. None of those timelines are highly likely to be achieved. So therefore, if you follow the logic in the program, it's going to be very, very difficult to achieve that notice of motion timeline. The second slide looks at the bigger picture. So again, this is tracking the main museum project timeline, depending on what option councillors pick. But in this one here, what I want to point you to is in the lower section, there's a green bar that's dashed. What that shows is if we did actually manage to achieve the councillor's motion, and we did actually manage to bring forward the demolition period, we would then have a vacant site. That vacant site would be around about 200 to 280 odd days, because the design process has to happen. Doesn't matter what option councillors pick. We have to wait until the councillor's decision has been made. The top bar and the bottom part bar, they both start at the same time because we need the option from council first. Once we have that option, we can go through the processes of design, etc., etc. So bringing the timeline forward, moving the SMAG collection forward, doesn't really benefit the museum main timeline, project timeline. The actual outcome is about 7 days, because the process has to start when councillors make the decision, not when SMAG is out of the building. I accept that you can carry out the demolition period portion sooner, but then you'd be left with a vacant site for a period of time, and that's probably worth noting to everybody. I'm sorry it's not super easy to read. It's just a very clumsy thing to try and put a Microsoft project spreadsheet out onto a PowerPoint and then up onto a screen in front of you, but hopefully the bars sort of tell a bit of a tale.
Okay, thanks, Lee. Right, before I open the floor up to questions, I'm actually going to move that we receive this report. That's recommendation 1. I'm going to leave the other recommendations at this stage. So I'll move that we receive this report. Can I have a seconder, please? Councillor Munsterton, I'm going to put the motion. All those in favour?
Aye.
Against? That report is received. Right, I will now open up to questions for both Steve and Lee. Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chair. As you can imagine, I've got quite a few, so let's work my way through them. Steve, most of my questions are directed towards you. So you say that by June we should have an option available after public consultation. Certainly the discussions that we've had around the table in the last 12 months has led me and other councillors to consider that we've already decided on Tisbury for the storage facility. We had other options, and that we've decided on a demolition plus a new facility as the go forward. So if you're saying to us that in March we will go to public consultation, there are 4 potential scenarios that we could put in front of the public, which I might add the Tim Walker report also canvassed, and that was strengthen the museum and do nothing else, strengthen the museum and future-proof it, build a new museum where the current museum is currently at, and finally build a new museum but not at Queen's Park. Now, I put it to you that we've considered the latter one of those, which is to look at potentially moving the museum elsewhere, and that could be to another building or to a new build, and that's been discarded. So the other 3 options, which are re-strengthen and future-proof, and build a new one where the pyramid is, all require the collection to be out of the building. No doubting that. So you're nodding, so that's helpful, because that's the core of what I want to throw up, is the issue of a sequential versus a parallel process. Sequential is you have to move the collection before you can start demolition and do the new one. You can't. My view is that you should run parallel process. So I'm pleased that you're nodding on that. You say in the submission also that we need to have at least, I think you quoted 12 months to finish cataloguing the collection and to parcel it up. So, question for you, I guess, is if we have a serious earthquake tomorrow, or we have a fire in the building, given that the roof is not fire retardant, so that's an insurance issue in its own right, and we can't repair that damage quickly, I guess staff or SMAG or a combination of both would have to move that collection as a matter of urgency. Right, you're nodding, that's great to see that. So what I'm saying is you can actually move it within the time frames that I've asked. The key that's stopping that is the desire to catalogue it. Now, I don't believe that you need to catalogue it before you move it.
Sorry, Councillor Clark, this is question time.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, I'll rephrase it. Why do you need to catalogue it before you move it?
If I might go back to your first question, Councillor, which was around the long-term plan and the deliberations and Council's decision. Yeah, you are right. There have been a numerous number of reports on this facility. You may recall back at the long-term plan deliberations, Council decided they had a couple of options to test, and they agreed and allocated funding of $39.9 million to a $52.5 million project. And you agreed to provide that. What you also asked, though, is that we commission the Museum Governance Group to go away and review whether or not that was the best investment, and because that was basically focused on a refurbishment of the existing facility. You asked the Museum Governance Group to review that decision and to test whether or not, with a vision and critical success factors established, whether that was the best value for money for the community and whether or not there was an alternative option that could be found. And so the last 6 months that Museum Governance Group has worked, and they've tested both the location, they've tested storage, they've tested the refurbishment option, and they've identified a couple of other options which will be out for consultation. Now this process is implementing Council's decision from last year. And so what we're doing is bringing back what Council asked officers to do, which is to bring advice on what is the best option for the museum going forwards. That's committed to the time frame set out in the long-term plan, and that will pose to you the impact of the budget and what that option might be. Now that's why we say we can't start the design on that part of it until Council makes that next decision on what is the best option. And at this point, Council hasn't decided that. In terms of the cataloguing, and I'll throw to Wayne, and Wayne, if you can grab a microphone, please. If we put things in boxes simply, we have to know what's in that box, because we have to then make sure wherever we put it, that it is stored appropriately for the content in that box. And part of the cataloguing is finding out what we have and the nature of that material and the storage that is required. If we don't do that and we just chuck things in boxes and then we move them, we're just delaying work, and we have to do that again at a later stage. And what we would then have to do is we'd have to then find out where those boxes are to then put them into a long-term facility. So that is essentially a double handling. So I might pass to Wayne around more of the technical requirements of that cataloguing process.
Thanks, Steve. So as part of the agreement which the Museum Trust Board reached 2 years ago was a process for the cataloguing which has been worked through all the way, which is the cataloguing and also the photographing of the collection. So we actually know what's in there. There's over 3.5 million objects sitting in the Southland Museum and Art Gallery collection. So they have been assembled since 1869. So we have quite a good collection that's available to us. If we were to simply uplift the collection as it is at the moment and relocate that collection somewhere else, then we're actually probably going to put our work behind by at least another 12 months. And one of the struggles that we do have within that 12 months is that firstly, the museum, Ministry for Culture and Heritage will require from us a list of objects which are deemed as being objects of national importance. So we may not be able to find those or even itemise those as part of that process if we've just simply rushed them out the door.
So follow-up question to that, Chair. It seems to me when I look at the data you've got that the major area that is yet to be catalogued is the Maori collection. So I'd like to know why you haven't commenced that 4 years down the track.
Wayne.
Thank you, Councillor. The Toka Māori collection is quite a specialised collection. So the work on that collection has been begun a number of years ago. In terms of the cataloguing, it's the rehousing of that collection, which is the work that we need to focus on at the moment. So a lot of what is known as stage one has been completed, which is cataloguing. But for me to report to you that it's ready to be moved, we need to make sure that it's packed and ready to go. So the next part of that process is actually the rehousing. Those numbers are being worked through at the moment, and they'll certainly be reported to the Museum Trust Board this week, because there has certainly been some movement from when we first spoke with Council in terms of numbers.
Moving on to the questions, you say, Steve, in the part on insurance that the insurance company may require 100% NBS. So the insurance at the moment doesn't require that, does it?
No, that's correct, Councillor. What we're signalling there is a risk that if we do shift the location, or if we do shift the collection to a new location, that could trigger a different discussion with our insurance broker, and that's the advice we're seeking at the moment, is what does that risk look like?
So some follow-up questions to that, Steve. Is the Civic Theater 100% NBS?
I might look to Erin to confirm that number.
Understand it is.
Sorry, Councillor, no, it's not 100% NBS. Most of the building sits above 80% NBS, there is a few elements of it that sit between 67 and 80.
Great. Which is well above the legal limit of 34%. And the same for the Scottish Hall. Is that rated at 100% or less?
Councillor, no, the Scottish Hall doesn't reach 67%. It is only just above the 33% that stops it from being declared an earthquake-prone building.
So when I looked at the issue of the time frames for commencing the demolition, and after the discussion I had with you and Aaron about a week ago, you said that there could be some potential, keyword being could be some potential, to claw back the overall project time frame. Was that right? I'm not trying to trap you into that.
No.
There could be
Aaron,
some
I might
options.
throw that question to you.
So yes, that's absolutely something that I said, was that there was an amount that you could potentially claw back. I said it was minimal, and I didn't think that it offset the risks of bringing the added complexity of, I guess, another strand of project into the broader program. That's the work that Lee has gone through and come down to that being actually not a matter of a few months, but actually a matter of probably a couple of weeks.
So again, can you give me some indication, either of you two, of what the cost will be if the time frames go the other way? What per year will it cost us if this project goes a year over schedule or 2 years over schedule?
Are you talking about the storage project or the
No, I'm talking about the main museum. $65 million, for argument's sake. That's the core figures that's been bandied around for the current schedule. What will happen if we go a year or 2 years over that time frame?
I think I'm happy for if Lee's got anything additional to say, but my view on that is I think none of us have got a crystal ball at this point in time with the economy. We're definitely in a trend where costs are rising significantly at the moment. That may decrease once we get 4 or 5 years out. It may continue to increase at a slower rate, or depending on what happens in COVID and, for that matter, world politics, I guess, at the moment, it may continue to escalate. I don't think we have any certainty around that at the moment.
Yeah, just a secondary question on that issue, because Aaron, you've advised council, and I've been party to that advice, that that last year building costs went up 14%. The Tim Walker report, which is sitting here, estimated 3 years ago that we would, this is before COVID I might add, that you would expect a 7% increase per annum ongoing, and economic commentators are saying for the foreseeable future around about 10%. So is it reasonable to assume, from your perspective, that the costs will go up year on year between 7 and 10%?
I wouldn't want to factor in the figures, but look, I think generally you would say that there is an assumption that costs will continue to go up unless something happens that's sort of particularly out of kilter. That's generally an assumption that you would make. What I would counter that with, though, and as Steve spoke to, is that yes, I understand what you're getting at in terms of the risk of the collection not being moved in time and that delaying the project. But I think adding in this additional quite complex phase of the project of moving it into a series of different homes at the moment and then moving it again later, that's not a straightforward process in terms of, sort of, Lee alluded to the fact that you're going to have to do some work in terms of fitting out those buildings, even if you don't put appropriate, I guess, storage in place and you're just putting boxes on the floor. You're still going to need to do work around security, things like that, to those buildings. That's got every likelihood of triggering consent requirements around specified systems. We haven't fully costed this work, but I wouldn't expect it to be in the hundreds of thousands. I would expect it to be in the millions of dollars to move this into temporary storage for a period of time. For me, that added complexity and that added cost actually puts the broader project timeline at a greater risk than managing the removal of the collection on a reasonable time frame, which is something that we can manage through our stakeholder process in the project.
Through you, Chair, I can't let that last bit of advice go unchallenged.
So we're here to ask questions. Sorry, we will be debating this later.
Sure.
Okay, so this is question time.
Well,
Councillor Clark, are you soon to finish, or just got
I haven't
another?
finished yet.
Okay.
Thank you. Aaron, you said that there would be unknown costs with potentially fitting out buildings to take it to a temporary situation. Can you advise what arrangements there are in the current Pyramid Museum for the storage? So do we have a whole lot of shelving, or are just about all the collections sitting on the ground on pallets?
Councillor, that's probably a technical question for Wayne.
Yep, sure.
The collection at the moment is currently sitting on a number of things, from shelves through to pallets ready to be relocated. So we've certainly been working through all of those, Councillor.
Yeah. And on a final thing, probably for Wayne or for Aaron, is it reasonable for me to assume that the security we have around the Civic Theater and the Scottish Hall and the fire compliance in both those buildings is of equal nature to what we've got in the museum, given that we've got a fire risk there?
Lee, jump in if you've got anything further to add, but that's part of the due diligence process that we'd have to do if we were moving the collection into temporary storage.
Yeah, that's part of the process timeline that, we would go to a building and we just assess to make sure it's fit for purpose.
Yeah, but surely if we've got people having events in the Scottish Hall and we've got events in the Civic Theatre and it's recently been upgraded for earthquake prone purposes, surely that's got to be at a standard better than an earthquake prone building where they're currently stored that has a major fire risk.
You can make those assumptions, yes.
Thank you. That's all from me, Chair.
Thank you. Yes,
Probably
Steve?
just one element to add on to security. This is not just security about people. This is security about our taonga and our collection. And a number of the things that Wayne can talk to you also about pest security and the current facility is also another factor we'd need to consider, especially with some of those old buildings that have been proposed. Wayne, in terms of the pest management that would need to be applied and a test?
There's a significant period of test management and reviewing of that data and material. So you need at least 3 to 4 months of rat traps, pest traps, everything from flies to silverfish within those proposed buildings before you even moved a single object in.
Thank you. Right. Ms. Cook.
So, part of what I was going to ask the question about has just been answered in the last remark. But the principal thing that I wanted to ask is, are any of those buildings climate controlled to the standard required to store vulnerable materials such as woven flax materials, fabrics, paper, wood that has been preserved because it's been rescued from the ground, or all those sorts of things that we know and are in the collection, particularly in the Tāka Māori collection, are either of those buildings that have been specifically mentioned meeting that standard at this time?
Highly unlikely, Councillor. Be part of the initial scoping would be to assess the HVAC systems and make the adjustments needed. So whilst they may have adequate fire systems, they may not suit in other areas.
So a follow-up to that is, are they less likely to take, are they more likely to take less than the approximately 6 or 7 months that it took to get Hiwakatuia's HVAC system up to standard before we could open there?
Could be very similar, to be fair.
Thank you. I just want to interrupt this meeting. Ms. Kudan, Councillor Crackett, can we please have live video? Look, it's an important part of standing orders for this meeting. So sorry about that, but we need live video. Thank you. Thank you. Right, further questions? Councillor Scott.
Thank you, through you, Chair. Wayne, at the workshop, I was somewhat passionate about the timeframes, along with Councillor Clark. And we talked about human resource issue, and obviously there's a lack of qualified in that particular area, which I absolutely accept. Given the change with the borders, just to perhaps find a solution, if there was one, would there be an opportunity with now the flow of people, that there may be an opportunity to assist in that human resource of looking after the collection? One point. But it seems to me from the report, which was very thorough today, thank you from the group, that it's not a human resource issue at all. It's more the procurement. It's more around our annual plan. It's around timeframes of things sitting into place. That's my understanding. So whilst I hugely support the thought of bringing anything forward, and I think we all would, is that a fair assumption from what I've heard today from one of you?
It's a very fair assumption, Councillor.
And just given the vacant site situation, I think it was 280 days, there is, having been involved in another situation, whilst we can be blasé about a vacant site, it actually has it's fraught with some of its own problems, to be fair, but particularly over a long period of time, not over a short period of time so much, but there is security and there's a whole raft of things involved around that. So the report has clarified for me, and just going back to you, Wayne, again around that human resource, it is obviously with that particular collection as well, we need specialised people, very much so.
Even with the borders open, our biggest challenge we have in New Zealand is actually the lack of professionals in a number of the areas. Working in museums is no longer seen as the fashionable thing it once was, so we're going to be challenged, even finding those human resources anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Scout. Further questions for Steve or Lee or Wayne? Councillor Clark.
Yeah, just 2 or 3 follow-up questions. Steve, last year I asked you what percentage of the collection you felt was temperature controlled or needed to be temperature controlled, like Evelyn has mentioned, and at that time you said 5%. Has that changed? In fact, I think you might have said 1 or 2%, but
Yeah, look, I'll throw to Wayne. He's got a greater handle on the element of climate-controlled collection.
To respond to that collection, I can't give you the exact percentage. What I can advise is there are certain elements within the collection that we do have to have specialist controls for, from spirit collections to nitrate negatives. Areas like that do require quite specialist treatment.
2 other quick questions, Chair. At one stage, staff, when they were considering the storage capacity for the new museum, reviewed a whole lot of commercial premises around town to see whether that could have been an option as opposed to a new build. Can you tell me how many commercial buildings you reviewed?
18.
18. Yep. Thank you. Any of those have temperature controlled?
Not from recollection, to be fair.
Did you review the QTV building, the second floor?
Offhand, I can't remember.
It's got nearly 800 square metres worth of capacity, and it is temperature controlled. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Okay, further questions for staff? Look, in that case, then I have a question. Really, I'll get Steve if you want to answer this one. Has this council yet formally decided and publicly announced whether it is repairing the existing museum or building a new museum? And if it is building a new museum, has it formally decided or publicly announced where that new build may occur?
Through you, the Chair. No, that would be part of the annual plan consultation, which commences later this month. And the second question, sorry?
Was about the location, if we did.
Yeah, no, again, that hasn't been determined.
Okay, I guess my question now is not of you gentlemen, but is Andrew or is Michael Morris here? No? Andrew, the question is going to be in regards to council's decision-making process. It's quite obvious from Councillor Clark's backup information that the requirement to move out the collection is so that the museum can be demolished for a new build. Now, obviously, we have not, as according to Steve has just told us, that council has not formally decided on any of these options, and it will be coming up in the consultation period. Jumping ahead to making a substantive decision today, would that impact on our decision-making process?
You'd have to be careful, particularly if you're going to consult with the community, I suppose, that you weren't perceived to have predetermined the issue. I mean, I would have thought if you make a decision today that only makes sense on the assumption that you are going to, whatever, rebuild at the existing site, then it would be hard pressed to, in fairness, say to the community you hadn't already made that decision. You could always reverse it, to be fair, but it would be a risk, an individual risk. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a risk for all of council, but it would be an individual risk for councillors who voted in favour of a proposition that didn't provide for an alternative down the track.
Point of order, Chair. You've just reflected an inaccurate position with my notice of motion. My notice of motion does not say that we want to remove the collection for the purpose of doing demolition work. It just says to remove the collection. No,
I'm sorry, I mentioned your supporting evidence.
Yep.
It says that, okay?
Yep.
Not the notice of motion, I said the supporting evidence.
Yep.
And that's why I've asked this clarification on process. Okay, the notice of motion is quite simple in its form.
Sure.
But the supporting evidence is definitely tied to the notice of motion, and you cannot deny that.
That's true,
No,
Chair.
no, I'm not arguing this. So, do you have a question?
I just want a clarification, if I may, and I'm not sure to whom I should ask it. But the collection does not belong to ICC, so you can give the SMAG board notice to vacate. I'm not sure legally whether you have the right to determine where they locate the items to.
Would you like that question?
And I would like some clarification about that, please, because the collection actually is not the council's collection. The collection is the SMAG board's collection. You know, so they therefore, I would have thought, should be the people who determine where the location goes.
There's a valid question. Who would like to answer that?
I think, Councillor Cook, I think there's a couple of things there.
Thanks. I think that's a difficult question for right now, because the council might recall that the SMAG board is a council-controlled organisation, and the council instructed me to write to the SMAG Trust Board, and it spoke to its representatives from its collegial organisations from the two other districts, with a view to that trust being repurposed so that the trust board would become a collection-centric trust. That has not yet been completed, but it is in the process. As at today, my advice would be that the council could write to the trust board and ask for its views on that. It could offer to work with it. But by the time we get further down this calendar year, I would imagine that the process would have changed. That the situation would have changed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, right. Further questions? Councillor Ludlow, then Councillor Scott.
Thanks, Chair. It might be a slightly stupid question, but it's wearing these masks fogs my brain up. Is there any reason why we can't progress the design and the process around construction of the storage facility, bearing in mind that is a potentially much easier construct to shorten up timeframes?
Yes, thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. Council consulted on storage as part of the long-term plan, and as a result, we are currently working to make sure that that time frame is as pushed as we can, and so we are undertaking that work at the moment.
Thank you.
Councillor Scott.
Through you, Chair, and just further to Councillor Ludlow's point in the expedition of the process, and I'll possibly ask Claire or whomever to answer, is there any opportunity, given the public perception and the public will and the expectation of council to move on the museum, is there any process under urgency that we could accelerate a process by making some decisions? And I take Councillor Pottinger's point as well. It was discussed or asked of Andrew regarding process, but because I'm not aware, is there any process that we have that we could expedite the decision-making process?
There is no process by which you could reduce. You can't reduce the community consultation time.
That was the point I was coming to. Just under urgency, or there's no vehicle.
Mr. Chair, I'd say that slightly differently. There's no good reason to, in the sense that we haven't had an earthquake, we haven't had a tsunami. There's no reason to forego building the trust and confidence of the community in our consultation, and indeed the sincerity of the consultation. I think you would lose more than you would gain.
Thank you.
Councillor Scott. Councillor Clark, you had a question.
Yeah, it was more about the initial lead-up information that Steve gave us, that there was an agreement between SMAG and the city, 2010 last reviewed, that they had an ongoing expectation to be in the building. But of course, at that time, the common belief around the council table was that SMAG actually owned the museum. And that was clarified some years ago by Claire to say, actually, we own the land and the museum. But again, that to me, it's just a red herring, really. We've got to move somewhere along the line. And again, if we had a disaster tomorrow, we would move. We would find places. We would take it to the Civic Theater. We would take it to other places that we do. And it wouldn't take us 3 months to do rat testing. We'd take the most vulnerable part of the collection, which might be 1 or 2%.
Sorry,
and we'd secure
is this
it.
a question you're asking?
Yeah. Okay. I'll leave it to my presentation.
Okay. So we're going to wind up the questions. Thanks, Lee, Steve, and Wayne behind the pillar. Okay, right. Councillor Clark, I'm going to let you have the floor for the notice of motion.
Thank you, Chair.
Just to alert councillors, this will be run to standing orders, so you get the opportunity to express your view once. You may ask questions at any time, and Councillor Clark at the end has a right of reply. Thanks, Councillor Clark.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just as a prelim of entering into this notice of motion, just want to advise that I want a division vote at the end, so that members of the public can see which way councillors are voting on this, on what I see as this critical issue. So, this notice of motion involves an unresolved but important issue to the ratepayers. My notice is has a supporting paper attached, which I won't go through word for word, which is wider than what the actual notice itself does. The notice is only proposing to move the collection away from the current site because I see it as a potential roadblock and a potential delay in the future. I've been careful not to enter into other debates about the long-term plan or the annual plan. It is of no interest to me to where the storage facility is, its cost or proposed location, nor is it of any interest to me around the demolition of the pyramid, the replacement of a new museum, if that's the option we go to, the scope, design, construction and cost of any future outcome. It is purely removing a potential roadblock. The only issue I present is a perceived delay, and that's caused by what I've mentioned before, which is a sequential process as opposed to a parallel process. For those listening in, a sequential process is one that is contingent on something else being done. So we've got to build a new storage facility or identify what outcome we have there and prepare it for the relocation to be moved, and then move the collection before we actually start demolition. My view is those two projects should not be linked. They should be parallel to each other. So if we can clear the collection out, we can start and make some traction on this. I'm reflecting on what ratepayers have told me, and I suspect have told many of you, is that they're fed up that the museum was closed in 2018, and they've seen little or no progress since then. And that's a position I support. And so it's a common perception, unfortunately, that council don't have an image in the community where they get things done. And that was reflected in the last long-term plan, where we had 4 or 5 projects at the front end of the thing. When we reviewed it 3 years later, only 1 of the 4 was actually done. And so I'm worried that this museum will not be closed for 7 or 8 years. It'll be closed for 8, 9 or 10 years. It's interesting in the feedback that we got in the long-term plan, which is the 2021 through 2031. And the submitters said 3 simple things. The most important was, and it was quoted in the report, long-term report, just get it done. Very simple statement. We don't want any more delays. They also said that the building of the museum and what shape it takes is less important than the contents or the individual experience that happens within that building. And the final thing they said was He Waka Tuia is not needed or is not well performed or well presented. So it's not a very good substitute. Based on the timeframes and the possible delays recently identified, our museum could be closed for 10 years. That's a whole generation of children that don't have that experience. And He Waka Tuia does not fill that void for me. There is also a very low level of confidence that we can deliver. And so that's reflected in projects like Anderson's House, the Water Tower, Rugby Park, now the museum, and even the Chinese Garden that seem to take forever to get done. With that historical backdrop, I see 2 further risks going forward in relation to the project that we have in front of us, which is the museum. Our inability to commence the demolition work of the existing but closed pyramid until a new storage facility is built and the collection currently stored in the pyramid is moved to the new facility. And it's been suggested that it's Tisbury, and I was interested to hear before that staff were saying that they are well advanced on looking at planning and things for the Tisbury site. Well, hang on a minute, we haven't even consulted on that yet. So you can't play the lack of consultation in one breath, but then be galloping down the track to where you want to be. And it's clear to me, and I think to anybody that's been involved in the last 12 months, that we are heading towards Tisbury, which I don't agree with, but that's the decision that we're likely to come to. And it's also the decision that we will have a new museum, which I do support. That unless we provide some leadership today and start the removal of the collection to temporary storage facilities, a new council could come in October and we could end up with further delays again. So it's really time to get started on this project. We've talked about it for 4 years. And in fact, if you look back in the history of the museum, this is the 3rd attempt we've had. Some time ago, many years ago, we had a shot at a new museum. It was 25 million. We had a second one more recently that was 45 million. And now we're heading to 75 million. You can see the increased costs in those timeframes. The second attempt, the $45 million one, fell over. And I don't mean physically fell over, but it never got off the ground because CETOS withdrew its funding. And they did that because they said there were unacceptable delays. And I see this current museum heading down exactly the same track. Between 2013 and 2018, SMAG has had a series of engineering reports that talk about the earthquake-prone status of the building. And there's the pile there. The museum has also been closed since 2018, that was 4 years ago, when council supported the withdrawal of staff on health and safety grounds. Interesting to note that over those 4 years, this council has had a team of people working in that building. Sure, they sign in every day. If you go new, you've got to have a briefing on health and safety. You have to wear a fluoro jacket and you have to wear a hard hat. So that is the degree of risk that's perceived for staff in that building. And my suggestion is wherever we take the collection, it has got to be far safer for the staff that are currently finishing off the cataloguing. And I've mentioned 2 buildings, but there are a whole lot more buildings around that could be used. And even more importantly, the buildings that we take them to are structurally far more sound than leaving the collection, especially parts of the Maori collection, which have been mentioned by Wayne as being of international significance, in a building that is earthquake prone at a very high level and has a fire risk in its ceiling. And so I think it's important that we move on that. Interesting that about a year after the museum was closed, we got a Tim Walker report, and it's a very detailed report. It looked at all the options that we could do. It costed out where temporary storage would be. So it's interesting now for the staff to say they've got no idea of the costs, and for Aaron to say it could run into the millions. Well, I've read the Tim Walker report, and it's quite clear about what the estimated cost would be to locate the collection of the temporary buildings, both here and, as he suggested, in Christchurch as well, where there were options. And it didn't run into millions of dollars. So it's disappointing that we've never tabled that report. SMAG withheld it for the best part of 2 or 2.5 years. It was leaked to the media, and since then it's just sat on the shelf. But we've used it when it suited us. And that's a very detailed report by a guy that's New Zealand renowned for, and probably internationally renowned for his work in this space. That's why SMAG got his consultation in the first place. And I think it's a sad indictment that we're going back reinventing the wheel there. He went through all the options and cost it all on. The other issue is the issue of timing of things. And it's interesting in the Walker report that he lists 4 options. He talks about the strengthening and reopening of the museum. That's the cheapest and quickest option with a 12-month time frame. Being mindful that we got this report in mid-2019. The second one was to strengthen and refurbish. That doubled the cost, but it future-proofed the museum. 24-month turnaround. Rebuild a new museum on the current pyramid site, requiring demolition, and building a new museum on alternative sites. Had 3 options. Each one of them had a time frame of 48 months, which is 4 years. So that's the total package. I don't understand why our project now is kicked out to 6 years. So all those options, bar the off-site one for the new build, require the collection to be moved. And that's where the sequential stuff comes in again. If we could move it quicker than our current timeframes, we could potentially bring the finish date for the museum, not the storage, but the finish for the museum forward 12 months, 18 months, 2 years. Well, I can tell you how much that saves in dollar terms. If you apply 7 to 10% of a $65 million thing, it's not rocket scientists. In that period, you'll save somewhere between $6.5 and $13 million. Now, you tell ratepayers when their rates go up why we haven't seized that opportunity. And I've heard a lot of reasons today in the package that was put up by the staff, and I don't agree with most of it. And so we've had time to do it, and it's time that we got on and did something. And to talk about needing to consult under the annual plan, we've had workshops recently. We've had presentations by the Reimagining Group. I mean, it's all led us down the option of Tisbury plus a new museum on site. So let's not go out and consult again. The community don't care less about where you put the storage. They want a museum out that they go into. They're never going to go into the storage facility. And I'll tell you now, you'll have heard it and I've heard it, that most people want that thing sorted. We don't need to consult to do it. We've already got the consultation and all the document we need through the Tim Walker report. The feedback we got at the long-term planning thing basically said 3 things. Get it done. We wanted at Queen's Park as part of the Queen's Park experience, and the awards we run that we had recently for the park, which is a credit to them, gives you that total experience. And the final thing they said is they want to maintain the pyramid. It doesn't mean the pyramid roof, but just the shape. And so that's what Tim Walker put up. Some people have seen that, some haven't. A really nice design. If it was up to me, I'd have the storage right next door with a smaller pyramid as well, but it's not up to me. So I think it's time that we got on and moved that. We have the potential for a little bit of unease, but the whole issue of testing for rats and other types of insects in a place like the Civic Theater just doesn't cut with me. And I just think we should get on, take the potential to deliver this project 1 to 2 years quicker, given that we've dragged our feet for 4 years now at least. And there is the potential there to save somewhere between $6.5 and $13 million. And given that we've recently nearly doubled our commitment to the city block, and so that's been a big hit that our future generations are going to face, And given that streetscape also took a hefty increase recently over what we projected, I think it's long overdue that we don't add a third additional cost to the ratepayers, because it doesn't affect me. I probably won't be here when this really truly kicks in, but a lot of the generations that follow us will not thank us for that increased cost that we're now piling onto them. And so, as I've said in my notice, I think we are within our rights as the owner of the museum to serve notice on SMAG to tell them to remove their things. It doesn't say where it needs to go to. SMAG can consult with us, can consult with the IPAG, consult with the Friends of the Museum, consult with each and every one of the councils. But there is space and reliable space it can go to. We need to say we need that space and we need it done. And the final thing I'll say is, in 2020, August 2020, this council got a very extensive report done. Invercargill City Council level of service research report. It engaged with about 880 people, including iwi and including groups like the Chamber of Commerce. It was an extensive report of how well we've done and what they thought about our future projects. Really interesting. 50% of the people canvassed said that the museum was their highest priority. 28% said the water tower. 23% said the alternative water supply. Anderson's house was at 21% and the rest just trickled away. And you ask yourself, which of those top 4 have we delivered on? And that we haven't. So my view is the motion should go forward and we should remove the collection, or not ask SMAG to remove it. They can take it wherever they like. At the end of the day, if there's any cost, we will end up funding it anyway. And that's our offer to them, but we need the space out so that we can get on and sort a new museum out, because any of the other alternatives, like re-strengthening, which I initially was in favour of, you'll recall 15 months ago I was in favour of that because it was the cheapest and the quickest option, but I now acknowledge that if we want a museum for the next 40 or 50 years, we need to invest in a new museum. So that's what I have to say, Chair.
Right, Councillor Clark, would you like to read out your notice of motion and also move it? And then I'll seek a seconder.
Sure. Notice of motion that ICC, as the owner of the Pyramid Museum, legally advised the SMAG Trust that the museum collection is to be relocated to alternative premises by no later than the 20th of December 2022.
Thank you. Do I have a seconder for that notice of motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'll second that motion, and in seconding it is just the delay.
Hold it. Right, you've seconded that motion. You don't immediately get to speak as seconder. Right, that's seconded. You may speak now. You can put your hand up. Sorry, I just was making sure that we had the seconder. Yes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This council and previous council, they tend to like closing down important facilities that we have there for our public and our visitors. The water tower was closed down 10 years ago, 2012, Anderson House 2014, and now the museum. Come April this year, that'll be 4 years, and it's delay after delay, meeting after meeting, workshop after workshop, and we're getting nowhere. And information I've received, obtained regarding the cost of the museum, that it's going up between 2 and 2.5 million every year, that nothing has been achieved. So far, with rising costs, getting out of hand, and construction costs, up until this stage, whatever the cost was going to be to renew or rebuild the museum would be up by 10 million at this stage. If it's another 4 or 5 years, you could add another 8 to 10 million onto that easily. Like, this is delay after delay, and it's real money we're dealing with. It's not play money, funny money, or monopoly money. It's ratepayers' money. So we've just got to get the job done, and that's why I'm seconding the motion put forward by Councillor Clark. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Right, I'm going to open this up for debate. I see Councillor Ludlow. And then Councillor Surf.
Thanks, Chair. Ultimately, I don't think that there's anybody that would object to shortening the time frame, and in that sense, I understand Councillor Clark's reason for a notice of motion. But there are either flaws or differences of opinion in some of the analogies that he's used and some of the things he said today, which I'll go through. When we use the analogy that, could we move the collection quickly if there was a disaster? Yes, of course we could. But there hasn't been a disaster. So why place additional risk around the security of the collection? If you needed to have a life-saving surgical procedure, you want to have it in a MASH unit or you want to go to a hospital? It depends on the risk to your life at the time. If it is urgent and it needs to be done on the spot, then yes, you'd take the MASH unit. Otherwise, you'd go for a hospital. I think everybody understands absolutely and empathises with the public frustration, but they don't have the same information that we have had or have access to, or in some instances just don't want to accept it, which was certainly the case when we went through the process of shutting down. And I don't think there's anybody, and I'm not sure who here was in the room that night that we wandered around the museum closing it, farewelling the collection. Reverend Cook, yes. But it was a pretty sombre night that I still reflect on a lot. And we absolutely want to see that collection, our taoko, back with the people. Hawakatuia is not a substitute. It was never intended to be a substitute. It is a stopgap measure through which we can still have some historical and artistic interface with the community. Council at the time recognised that the scale of it was not going to meet the needs of two organisations, IPAG and SMAG, but it was something when we didn't really have any other options. There was the event in Christchurch 12 years ago that changed the landscape of how everything operates in New Zealand, and that's why there are now several buildings that are inaccessible. And it's not a peculiar to Invercargill thing either. Political interference has actually been a big result of some of the project delays right from the beginning. And in some cases, the original proposal that was put forward by SMAG could have been handled in a better way. For example, it talked simply about a building rather than about what was inside it. SMAG, just to correct some statements that were made, SMAG did not withhold the Tim Walker report. SMAG, several members were chomping at the bit to have it released, but it wasn't SMAG's report. There is an obligation for council, I think, to consult with the public, even though we have gone out at least twice, if not three times before, and have a reasonably good steer, simply because of the amount of money that's involved. We've had challenges around pest issues during this last year, so that's a real thing. We're not, making that up for giggles. We had real challenges finding a space that became Hawakatuia. And even then it wasn't suitable, so work had to be done to bring it up to standard, and even then it took longer than was needed. There were complications. So going through a process, I think personally seeing the storage facility advanced as quickly as possible, so it's a really good first step in getting the collection out and rehoused. You can instruct SMAG to have the collection out by whenever you want, but SMAG doesn't have the funds to store it elsewhere. So ultimately, it's going to be up to YCC to meet that cost. I do agree with Councillor Clark's reflection on the design, the Tim Walker design. And my personal opinion is, yeah, I'd like to see the storage facility right next door too. It's just, in my mind, a lot more convenient. But I also understood the explanation for around why other locations like Tisbury were being looked at. So while I don't support the notice of motion as it stands, I do understand and support its intent to try and bring the project forward to as soon as possible. Council is taking, in the advice that we've received and the timelines and the figures that we've been using, a conservative approach. And I think that's really wise, because if we went for an optimistic one, and when we miss, that's going to be a challenge. Whereas taking the conservative approach offers more comfort around actually being able to deliver what it is we say we're going to, possibly in timeframes that are shorter, but if not, to those timeframes. Possibly at costs that may be lesser because we're able to find additional funds from elsewhere. But if not, we're going to need some backups. And again, we went through some of that at the workshop a week ago. So I don't support the notice of motion. I do support the intent. Thank you, Chair.
Right, Councillor Soper.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm going to try and not have quite such a long speech as others have had on this, and I'm going to try and address the actual notice of motion and what it is actually asking us to do. And I'm going to start my remarks by a preface that says, the community don't care less, a phrase Councillor Clark used in his presentation, is one of those phrases that sounds the death knell of democracy. Once you start using that phrase or phrases similar to it, you've started down the slippery slope where personal opinions overcome consultation, overcome expert advice, and you might as well start doing everything under urgency, because you are fundamentally saying your community couldn't care less what you do, so let's do everything under urgency. Having said that, I'll get to the actual notice of motion. I have in my professional career packed, moved, stored, and then unpacked 3 libraries due to new building developments. I'm very well aware of the logistics, the planning, the time frame, and the resources that go into actually doing a job like that, and it's a professional job. It is not something you do by the seat of your pants or on a sudden demand that you will do it within a few months because your political masters decide to change the timeframes. And in my case, in those moves, I was dealing with 95% catalogued materials and only a small proportion of historical materials requiring special treatment. And I was mainly dealing in the terms of pests with the dangers of silverfish. Precipitate moving of the collection in a seat-of-the-pants action will contribute nothing to the building of a new museum. It will, in my opinion, assuredly distract staff time and resource from the actual progressing of a newly developed museum, which is what every one of us around this table want to achieve and see as our top priority. And it will assuredly put significant parts of the collection at risk. On those grounds, I'm opposed to this motion and I will be voting against it. I see no sense in a motion that demands such short-term, ill-thought-out action when there is a plan and a process that will mean we protect our collection for now and into the future, and we will not distract from actually achieving the new development that we all want, and that we asked a special governance group to put vision and thought into giving us some recommendations towards. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Saber. Councillor Amundsen.
Thanks, Chair. I'm also going to speak against this motion, and I find it interesting that the Tim Walker report has been mentioned several times, and the fact that it was shelved, because as I recall it, one of the reasons that ended up being shelved was because of a notice of motion that led us down the path that we're currently on. That was actually done by Councillor Clark and Councillor Biddle at the time. And I agree that the Tim Walker report was a great report and it had lots of potential, but because we chose to go down the notice of motion route then, we stepped away from that report, and that's one of the reasons why it stayed on the shelf. So I also think it's a bit misleading to say that this process has been delayed, because I don't actually think it's been delayed either. It's been our council decision making and how we've made these decisions that has led to the time that has passed, taking the amount of time that it's taken to get to where we are today. I actually think that what we have now and what we are moving into is a really thorough, planned approach to making sure that this museum will happen in the way that we would like it to. I think the risks that were identified in the report from the council officers speak for themselves, and as part of the team that was part of the process for establishing Hawakatuia, I can remember very clearly us coming up with this brilliant idea and thinking that we would have a building to move into in a few days, and months later we were still trying to find a building. And then we found a building and we thought, yay, we're going to have our interim museum in a couple of months. And again, I think it was, a long process to get the lease put in place, and then to do the consent process, and then to do the fit out, and all of the things that happened along the way with doing that, which meant that it was a long, slow process. So I have no doubt in my mind that moving a collection into some other buildings as a temporary measure, while it might have good intent, from a practical point of view, is not going to be as easy as said than done. As such, I think that there is no benefit whatsoever to supporting this notice of motion and this action. I think that it really essentially just shows a dismissive and disrespectful attitude towards our region's heritage by treating it in such a blasé manner, and I think that there are no gains from supporting this motion.
Thank you, Councillor Munson. Look, understanding orders, and in the theme of urgency, which we're talking about, we've had 3 people speak against the motion, and I'm actually going to ask for another person who may want to speak in favour of the motion, because we do have a very busy schedule today. And that's so. Is there any other elected member who would like to speak for the motion? I see a finger raised, Your Worship. Are you awake, Councillor Saber? Okay.
Yes, when we come across a dilemma like this, or differing points of view, I think you've got to go back in history and reflect on the past. How did we get to the stage we're at now, and what were the arguments put forward? And the only big times issue I can remember was when we had a snowstorm, and I forget how many cars Peter Ketop, Councillor Ketop, and quotes it. I think it was 190 cars falling on the roof of the sports stadium, and the choice was get in straight away, don't muck around, don't worry about how it happened so much, but just get on with the job. And in no time at all, we had a new stadium, twice as strong as any previous development along those lines. And I view that same principle, and it's not out of disrespect, but that same way of overcoming a crisis, and it can be followed. So I'm supporting councillors who support this motion.
Right, we have, and I apologise for this, but we are under extreme pressure today with the PPP meeting and workshops. So, yeah, so I'm going to move this along, and Councillor Clark, you do have the right to reply, so I'll give you that.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of comments on some of the colleagues' comments.
And if you could make it brief, we'd appreciate it. Yeah.
Sorry?
If just just a couple of minutes.
Sure, that's all it'll take. Yep, just a reflection on some of the comments that have been made. Councillor Ludlow referred to the MASH unit. Well, I've been in a MASH unit, but it's a side issue. But the difference between needing a MASH unit and needing a hospital. Well, I would certainly not call the current Pyramid Stadium a hospital. It's earthquake prone, and it has a significant fire risk in the ceiling. And so, but I hear what the others are saying. It was interesting to mention that Leslie said that democracy was undermined by taking issues under urgency. Well, the SMAG group and Councillor Ludlow said it wasn't SMAG that authorised or sought the report or paid for it. I'm not sure what he said there, but it'd be interesting from his reflection to know who owned that report, because everything I see in here talks about SMAG, and certainly in the opening paragraph on the Walker report it does say that Ken Gorby initially started the review on behalf of the board of the SMAG in 2015. So that's the starting point for looking at a new museum, and we are now 8 years down the track. It's a bit of a damning indictment on us because we're no further down the track than that report there. So that's all I've got to say. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Clark. Right, I am going to put the motion, and as at the request of Councillor Clark, Claire will be taking a note of who votes yay and nay. So I'm going to put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye or raise your hand.
Could we have it by division, please?
Yeah, well, raise your hand, please. Okay, we have
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Councillor Kett.
No one on Zoom. Shadbolt, Skelt, Arnold, Clark.
And Clark.
Okay. Those against, please raise their hands. So on Zoom we have Crackett and Coote, and in the chamber we have Lush, Arnold.
No, Amundsen.
Amundsen, sorry. Ludlow, Lewis, Cook, and so and the chair. Pottinger.
Thank you. These marks. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10.
The brain fog was
5, 6, 7.
We've got one missing.
Yeah, we got
Abbott is
missing.
An apology.
9-5, is it?
7, 8, 9.
Should have 14.
14. I've obviously counted someone twice. I can see it. Yes, 9-5.
9-5. We have those names, and they will be in the minutes.
Yeah.
That is defeated. That notice of motion. Thank you, people.
I apologise, I have to leave.
Okay. That's good. Yes. Right. That takes us back now to the last three remaining recommendations from the staff report. Can we have that? We've got that. No. There we go. Okay. That is I'll just get it up myself. That is noting that the committee recognise progress made on packing the collection via the Museum and Heritage Services monthly activity report. 3, agree that the committee write to the Southland Museum and Art Gallery Board noting the intention to amend the lease agreement in line with the proposed Te Unua project. And 4, note that the officers advised that endorsing the proposal to vacate the building by the 20th December 2022 has a number of complexities, and working through that program it could place the overall delivery of Te Unua by 2027 at risk. So can I have someone move those 3? Thank you, Councillor Soper. Seconded, Councillor Lewis. I'm going to put that motion. All those in favour?
Aye.
Against? That is, those recommendations are carried. Thank you. That now takes us to something completely different. Disposal of land for pump station purposes.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I will have to vacate at this point.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we have a pump station expert.
We certainly do, or a land expert.
Welcome, Heather.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Hi, Carolyn.
I've got Caroline with me as it
Hello,
relates to reserve land. So the report in front of you is in relation to Environment Southland wanting to take a parcel of current Lake Hawkins Reserve to extend their pump station, or put a new pump station on that piece of land, and the activity rightly sits with Environment Southland, and this is an opportune time for them to do so. So if there's any questions.
Okay, I'll just hold you there. We've got a Pani, do you wish to say something? Oh, no. Sorry, the hand was up. Sorry. Right, questions for both Carolyn. No, I didn't hear that. Councillor Ludlow.
Not a question, just a statement. Obviously, my wife's a councillor on Environment Southland. I have an interest. I don't believe I have a conflict.
No, thanks for declaring that. Right, questions?
You've got no conflict with Rundle.
Not till I get home.
Right, that's very good. Right, we have 3 recommendations that we received the report, and the report recommends to council that an application be made to the Minister of Conservation requesting the portion of the land required to be transferred to Southland Regional Council, in brackets Environment Southland, pursuant to section 52 of the Public Works Act 1981, and that the CE be given delegated authority to enter into a memorandum of agreement pursuant to the Public Works Act 1981 presented to this meeting. Can I have someone move that, please?
I'd so do, Chair.
Councillor Lewis, seconded Councillor Amundsen. I'm going to put the motion. All those in favour?
Aye.
Against? That is now carried. Thank you.
Thank you.
That takes us on to the activities report. And for infrastructure, Erin, do you want to take that?
Thank you, Chair. I'll ask Mr. Gibling to give his update on his portion of the report, and we can do questions for that. I am just conscious that I will need some time for the infrastructure portion following that.
Right, okay.
Through you, Mr. Chair, hidden behind the corner. Look, I'm happy to take any questions. I just would like to make a couple of points. Probably the one primary point is Queen's Park retaining a 5-star rating, and obviously also celebrating this month winning of the Kiwis Choice Awards. I just want to pass on, I guess, the staff's congratulations to the team who make that place work. I think it's great recognition. So thank you. Happy to take any questions on my report.
Right, questions for Steve, anyone? Yes, Councillor Munson.
I see in the pool report that you had a band playing for 3 afternoons, which was well received, and I attended Shakespeare in the Park at the start of the month of February, and at the end of that they had a musician playing in the Chinese garden, and it was lovely because they were on one side of the pond and we were all sitting on the other side of the pond listening. And the comment was made to me then, oh, how come this kind of thing doesn't happen more often? And then I saw this was happening at the pool, and I'm wondering, are you able to extend that to things happening in the park and other places as well?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Look, it's a case of resourcing, and we have great partnerships with community groups who run these types of events. In the pool in particular, though, we're also trying to target our young people. And as you'll see through the numbers of participations in the facility, our team are having to work incredibly hard to achieve participation and confidence in the services. And so they are trying some new things in order to get people coming back through the doors. And it is under this COVID environment that is proving harder and harder to do.
No further questions for Steve? Okay, Aaron, Councillor Clark.
Just a reflection on the Three Waters transition commentary there. You'll recall...
That's, sorry, for Steve, I'm talking about. Questions for Steve, not about the activity report. This is just under his section of parks, pools and...
Oh, I see, sorry.
And then Aaron will take over.
Sure, thank you.
Just a quick question, Mr. Chair, just regarding, Steve, the centre plots and roundabouts in town. Is this an appropriate time to bring up? Is there any plan to tidy some of them?
You mean the mowing of them and the daisies?
Well, the one by the airport specifically is the chief executive's nodding. And
I know exactly what you're talking about, Councillor Arnold. I noticed
also
it
all the way
myself.
down D Street, you know, like we've got plants growing that are sort of 2 feet high in concrete. So just, is there any plan there?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair, Councillor Arnold, the team are working incredibly hard on managing within our resources to try and achieve the best presented city we can. In those road environments, we have traffic management plans that do require quite a lot of work, and that sometimes delays the ability for our teams to get onto those parts in the manner that we want, but I know that those particular areas have been tidied up this week or in the process of being tidied up this week. We have all identified that they are not up to the standard we want.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd just like to comment that that hasn't happened. That hasn't happened yet. And there was a time when there was new flowers planted biannually by the Parks and Reserves Department. I congratulate you on Queen's Park, but I just think, as far as D Street goes and the airport roundabout especially, those are the gateways to the city. So those are what everybody sees. I think it's extremely important that. What do you think, Steve?
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. Our team are managing to the resources that we've got, and you'll note in some of those roundabouts the transition from biennial plantings to natives. That, in a way, is trying to mitigate and manage the cost escalation that's required for traffic management plans and all the health and safety requirements. So we are trying to present those areas in the best manner we can, and we're doing that within the resources we've got allocated.
Okay, thanks for raising that.
Oh well, I look forward to seeing that, and I guess some of those weeds are natives.
Right. Okay. Look, that's all for Steve. Aaron.
Thank you, Chair. I'll take most of the report as read. The key element that I just wanted to draw to attention was the piece of the report around water conservation. At the time that this report was put together, which was only early last week, you'll note that we had approximately 15 cumecs as the flow in the Ariti River. In that week, we have dropped again due to dry conditions down to about 8 cumecs, which means that we're once again coming under risk of needing to put in place water conservation measures for our community. Now we've got plans in place as to how we would need to do that, communications, how we would actually make sure we're out educating people on that. We are forecast to continue to have a dry March. We're obviously continuing to watch the weather, and as long as we get enough rain to get us through this period, then there may be no need for those measures, but just wanting to make sure that councillors are aware that it is a dry time at the moment, and we are having to keep a very close watching brief on our water.
So are we asking, we're not asking the public for water restrictions yet?
Not I guess, formalised water restrictions at this stage. What we have done though is there's been both radio and Facebook communication out to people, just noting the fact that it is dry weather and some tips around how you can conserve. At this stage, we are simply asking people to take those measures. But you'll note from the report, if we drop below those figures of 4 QMEX, then that becomes more formalised measures under our resource consent for water abstraction.
So I take it that trigger point of 4 still gives you, it's not suddenly trying to run out of the building when it's on fire. You're well ahead of the game. You know, it's
That's right. We're simply required to be putting those restriction measures in place. The next level comes down, which we haven't reached to my knowledge historically, is that eventually we reach a measure where our abstraction limit is not to take more than 20% of the total Ariti supply. But at this stage, that's not something that anybody has experienced here to what they've told me. But we are obviously keeping a close watch on it.
Okay. Any questions regarding Councillor Clark?
Yeah, 2 questions. One is about the conservation of water. Can you give us some idea of where the drilling for an alternative water supply is actually at? We've talked about it for quite a few years, and it is quite a strategic risk for the city.
Absolutely. So there has been drilling that's been underway since last year. We've now got test bores down, which are essentially abstracting water, and we are monitoring the quality of that water and having it assessed by a professional firm. The intention is to come back to council next month and report on both the findings from the volume of water and the quality of water that's been sourced from that project. And also, I guess, just to flag a broader strategic conversation for us to have, or for council to have, around what we might want the use of that water to be and how we may actually invest in that going forward.
Sure. And the second issue is the Three Waters transition commentary that's there. Just want to note for the record that if we cast our minds back, that the DIA on behalf of the government asked us last year not to consult with our communities at that stage and gave us an 8-week period to put up our concerns, which you quite rightly reflect have not been answered. And I find it interesting that last week cabinet papers were released under the Official Information Act that show that 3 months before we were asked to consult in that 8-week period, government had already made the decision to mandate Three Waters. And so I guess just want to reflect that's an area of frustration, and I think a lot of councils around the country feel quite let down by that process that they entered into the 8-week consultation period in good faith, didn't get any replies, only to find out the decision had already been made, and the opportunity to consult with their communities went with that as well. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, that's right. No, we need to consult with our communities, and that was not fair. Okay, any further questions?
Oh,
No, yes, Your Worship.
just a brief thing. I'm up and asked if the water tower is actually functioning as a water tower. I forget what the answer.
Yes, Your Worship, the water tower continues to be connected to the supply and is a functioning part of the network.
Oh, thank you.
Right, the recommendation is that the activities report be received. I've moved that, seconded Councillor Ludlow, and put the motion. All those in favour?
All right.
Against? That is now carried. Now we're going to move to public excluded, and this is the freeholding of land.